Welcome to Ethan's Revenge Domain.
Why are we paying him this much? The question wasn't whispered. It was projected, sharp and deliberate, through the glass walls of the executive conference room so clearly that half the floor could hear it. I was 20 feet away at the coffee machine, hand hovering over the dispenser, watching the scene play out through transparent glass that made privacy a design suggestion instead of a reality. On the other side of that glass, the new VP of Operations, Ethan Lowell, 31, polished, loud, and very sure of himself, held up a printed spreadsheet like it was a criminal indictment. His finger stabbed at a highlighted row. "My point is right here," he said, turning so our CFO and two board observers could see. "This compensation package makes no sense. Legacy roles like this are exactly why our cost structure is bloated." He didn't have to say my name. Everyone in that room knew whose line item he was pointing at. Senior Director, Risk and Compliance Architecture. Base, bonus, long-term incentives. 14 years of experience condensed into a number Ethan had decided was too big for his taste. From where I stood, I could see his profile clearly. Perfect haircut, tailored suit. The kind of watch that's meant to be noticed but not commented on. 6 weeks in the company and already rearranging the furniture. "This is absurd," he continued, pacing slowly along the length of the table. "We're paying almost triple market median for a function that modern platforms can handle at a fraction of the cost. We're not a charity for tenure. We're running a business." I didn't move, didn't clear my throat, didn't walk away. If there's one thing you learn after 14 years in financial risk, it's how to sit with rising tension without flinching. Ethan had no idea that 3 months earlier, during the last round of acquisition negotiations, my attorney had spent 10 hours over 2 days on a single section of my employment agreement. No idea that buried in that document, under harmless-sounding headings and numbered subsections, was one clause his team had skimmed, misread, and then ignored. No idea that 2 weeks ago I had sent a memo highlighting that clause in red, explaining exactly what would happen if anyone tried to restructure my role without following the specified process. Legal had acknowledged it. HR had filed it. Then everyone had moved on because the numbers on Ethan's spreadsheet looked more interesting than the words in my contract. Now he was performing competence for the board, wielding my salary as proof that he was serious about efficiency. What he didn't understand yet was simple. He wasn't questioning a number. He was tugging on a tripwire. By the following morning, that one clause, the one he'd been too busy to read, would turn his savings initiative into a catastrophe. Within 24 hours, the company would be staring at $2.7 billion in client redemptions, a regulatory emergency, and a compensation acceleration bill that made my salary look like petty cash. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and show you how one quiet, contract-obsessed risk director watched a new VP swing an axe through the one support beam holding the roof up, and how the fine print he'd ignored did exactly what it was designed to do. If stories like this, where executives underestimate the people quietly keeping the place alive until it blows up in their face, hit a little too close to home, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. These stories help the people who do the invisible work remember they're not crazy and they're not powerless. Now, let's go back to where this actually started. My name is Ryan Blake. I'm 47 years old, and until 3 months ago, I was Director of Risk and Regulatory Architecture at Northline Quantitative Services, a financial analytics firm based in New York. It's not the kind of title that gets you invited on stage at conferences. It's the kind of title that shows up in footnotes of regulatory filings and in the CC line of emails nobody outside your world ever wants to read. My job was simple to describe and hard to replace. Make sure nothing we did got our clients, or us, destroyed by regulators. I didn't come up through sales. I didn't come from an MBA feeder program. I came from the other side of the table. For 10 years, I worked as an examiner at the Office of the Controller of the Currency. My team's job back then was to walk into banks and institutions with a laptop and a badge and see whether their risk and compliance story held up under pressure. I learned what real scrutiny looks like, what examiners actually care about versus what companies think they care about, which weak spots regulators treat as fixable and which they treat as unforgivable, how risk models behave in the wild versus how they look in glossy presentations. I also learned something nobody in a growth meeting ever likes to talk about. Regulatory trust is a finite resource. Once you lose it, you don't buy it back with a slide deck. When Northline recruited me 14 years ago, they weren't looking for a checkbox compliance officer. They were looking for someone who could build a risk backbone strong enough that they could grow aggressively without snapping. Back then, Northline was a niche player, smart people, clever models, maybe 10% as big as they thought they should be. Their clients were institutional investors, pension funds, insurers, asset managers whose job was to steward other people's futures. Our tools helped them understand portfolio exposures, stress test positions, and stay ahead of regulatory shifts. But behind the scenes, their own house was optimistic at best. There were 3 reasons I joined. They knew they had a problem. They were willing to let someone who understood regulators fix it. They were willing to put that in writing. All 3 of those mattered more than the initial offer. The money was good, but the leverage was in the structure. The first 3 years at Northline were the textbook definition of earned trust. No shortcuts. I did the unglamorous work, mapping every data flow that touched a regulated process. Rebuilding reporting pipelines so that what went to clients and what went to regulators actually matched. Creating escalation processes for anomalies so small issues didn't become headline problems. I built risk frameworks, not just policies. Policies sit in binders and intranet pages. Frameworks show up in daily decisions. I trained product managers to recognize when a feature request had regulatory implications. I built relationships with client compliance teams so they called me before escalations became emergencies. I created the exam playbooks that meant when a regulator knocked, we didn't scramble. The proof wasn't that we never had issues. The proof was that we never had surprises. Northline's client base grew from a dozen institutions to over 60. Assets under analytics went from tens of billions to hundreds. Eventually, we passed the trillion mark. That's when the acquisition started. Private equity loves businesses like Northline once they're past a certain scale. Recurring revenue, sticky clients, compliance reputation, clean margins. 3 years ago, Acheron Equity took a controlling stake. They sent in the usual wave of advisors with questions about efficiency opportunities, scalable governance, consolidated platforms. I sat through a dozen diligence meetings. What they kept circling back to on the risk side was key person dependency. Translation: what happens if Ryan gets hit by a bus? It wasn't an unreasonable question. Too many of our processes had my name on them, formally or informally. So we did 2 things. I documented the hell out of everything I'd been doing. My attorney, a woman named Laura Ng, made sure the legal documentation recognized the real risk they just identified. That's how Section 8.4 ended up in my employment agreement. On the surface, it looked like standard senior exec protection, deferred compensation, equity vesting, performance bonuses tied to client stability. Underneath, it was more specific. Laura had learned the same lesson I had. Abstract protections don't hold when new people show up with different priorities. The clause said in plain terms, if my role was eliminated or materially changed without a defined transition period, board-level review, and specific risk mitigation measures agreed in writing, then all deferred comp and unvested equity tied to my role's continuity would accelerate. Additional amounts, indexed to any client outflows triggered by my removal, would become payable. Certain client contracts, those with explicit continuity provisions referencing my function, would be treated as breached unless properly transitioned, with penalties defined in the client documents, not ours. In other words, if you decide I'm unnecessary, you're betting that my absence won't shake client confidence. If you're wrong, you pay for the miscalculation. Nobody had a problem with that when Acheron came in. At the time, the PE partners understood exactly why it was there. They'd seen what happens when a big client asks, "Where did our risk architect go?" And the answer is, we fired him to save money. They weren't about to cheap out on the one seat that kept regulators and clients calm, but PE firms have their own life cycles. By the time we get to Ethan in the glass conference room, some things had changed. Acheron had partly exited. New money had come in. New CEO, new narrative, and a new VP of operations who thought experience was an inefficiency. Ethan arrived with a playbook. You could see it in everything he said. First month, listening tour with all department heads, requests for org charts, cost breakdowns, pain points. Lots of nodding and note-taking with very few follow-up questions. Second month, Operational Excellence Initiative announced by email. Mentions of right-sizing legacy functions and embracing automation in non-core areas. A carefully chosen internal slogan about doing more with less. We'd all seen versions of this movie, but there was a difference this time. Most of the time, when an ops exec starts waving around efficiency decks, they're constrained by quiet guardrails, legal risk contracts. This time, Ethan thought those guardrails were handrails, decorative, to hold while you climbed past them. He and I met twice before the blow-up in the glass conference room. The first time, he tried charm. "Ryan Wright," he'd said, offering a firm handshake. "I've heard your name more times than I can count in the last 2 weeks." "That usually means either I've been very helpful," I said, "or very expensive." He laughed like we were sharing a joke. "Our compliance and risk footprint is impressive," he said. "I'm just trying to understand where we might be overbuilding. You know, standard optimization." I walked him through our architecture, why certain reports stayed manual, why we layered automated monitoring with human review, how our expensive processes had prevented enforcement actions that would have cost far more than my line item ever did. He nodded, asked decent surface questions, then dropped the first hint. "Do you think all of this is sustainable?" he asked. "Given where we're headed." There's that word again, sustainable. It's rarely about systems. It's about salaries. I answered honestly. "It's sustainable if you understand what it's buying you," I said. "It's unsustainable if you think all risk functions are the same as a cheaper vendor selling dashboards." He smiled, thanked me for my time, and I knew I'd just been flagged. The second meeting was more direct. He had numbers this time. "Here's the thing," he'd said, turning his monitor so I could see. "If I look strictly at cost, your department is an outlier. Headcount, comp, external advisory fees tied to your frameworks. I see a lot of red." "If you color everything in terms of short-term profit," I replied, "risk always shows red, until the day it saves you." He didn't love that answer. "Let me be transparent," he said. "No decisions yet, but we will be reevaluating senior roles, especially ones that look overcompensated relative to market." That was when I sent the memo. 2 weeks before the "Why are we paying him this much?" performance, I wrote a 4-page document. To CEO, General Counsel, Head of HR, Board Risk Committee Liaison. Subject: Risk Role Structure, Contractual Provisions, and Client Continuity. I didn't posture. I didn't threaten. I laid out facts. My employment agreement contained a continuity clause triggered by elimination or unapproved restructuring of my role. Several of our largest clients had contractual provisions requiring notice and approval of changes to senior risk compliance leadership. Those client provisions contained withdrawal or early termination rights if continuity wasn't maintained or properly transitioned. A rushed cost savings move in my area could trigger both the internal clause and multiple external clauses simultaneously. I attached the relevant section of my contract with the key language highlighted, a summary of the 5 largest client agreements referencing my role or function, a risk scenario analysis showing potential outflows if those provisions were ignored. Legal replied the same day, "Received, thanks, we'll review." HR acknowledged receipt and said they'd factor it into planning. The CEO didn't reply. Ethan replied with one line, "Appreciate the context, will be thoughtful," which translated meant, "I've seen the tripwire, I'm choosing to pretend it's a loose cable." Now back to the glass conference room. The one where Ethan was holding up my comp like a scalpel. He turned a page, tapping my row again for emphasis. "This single individual costs us more than 3 senior engineers combined," he said, voice firm. "We're not a regulator. We're a data company. We can't keep overinvesting in defensive roles at the expense of growth." Our CFO, Alina, shifted in her chair. She knew what my frameworks had saved us over the years. The two board observers exchanged a look. They'd been around long enough to see what happens when a firm signals to its largest clients that compliance and risk are now cost centers to be pruned. But board observers don't run operations. They observe. I watched Ethan scroll to the next slide. Proposed changes, the title said. Bullet points. Reassign risk architecture responsibilities to central ops analytics. Consolidate regulatory engagement into standard legal function. Phase out legacy director role over 60 days. Underneath, in smaller font, estimated annual savings, $720,000. That was the number he cared about, not the numbers that would show up later when some of our largest clients read about leadership changes they weren't consulted on and started making calls of their own. He looked around the room, reading faces. Any objections from finance? He asked. Alina hesitated. As long as we have legal sign-off on contractual risk, she said carefully, finance can implement whatever structure leadership agrees on. He turned to legal. Our general counsel, Priya Menon, had her laptop open, expression tight. We've reviewed standard employment terms, she said. From our perspective, the company retains flexibility to restructure roles as needed. Standard terms. Not the phrase I'd been waiting to hear. Section 8.4 was not standard. Ethan nodded, satisfied. Then here's my recommendation, he said. We notify Ryan of the restructuring this week. We offer a generous severance and transition support. We reassign his team under centralized ops, and we move into next year with a leaner, more scalable model. He said it like he was closing a case. The board observers stayed quiet. I set my coffee down. I could have walked back to my desk, waited for the calendar invite, acted surprised in the meeting, tried to negotiate from a weaker position. Instead, I walked toward the conference room door. Nobody stopped me. The glass didn't block sound, it just gave the illusion it should. I opened the door and stepped in. The room went still. Sorry to interrupt, I said evenly. I figured since we're discussing my role, it might be helpful if the person whose compensation we're waving around is actually in the room. Ethan blinked. Ryan, we were going to loop you in right after this, he said. We're just talking strategy. Good, I said. Then let's talk strategy properly. I pulled a thin folder from under my arm and set it on the table near Priya. That's the section of my contract your team filed 3 years ago, I said, and the client clauses it connects to, section 8.4, the one I sent you all a memo about 2 weeks ago. Priya opened it. Her eyes moved faster than her face could keep up. Alina leaned over to read. Ethan tried to look unconcerned, but his fingers tightened on the paper in his hand. I'm not here to argue for my salary, I continued. I'm here to make sure everyone making decisions understands what those decisions trigger. Ryan, Ethan said, something like irritation creeping into his tone. We appreciate your contributions, but we can't let any one person hold the company hostage with contract language. This is bigger than one role. Exactly, I said. I turned to the board observers. When Acheron came in, your due diligence team flagged key person risk in the seat, I said. They asked what would happen if I disappeared overnight. The answer at the time was ugly. One of the observers, a man named Daniel Price, nodded almost imperceptibly. He remembered. So they did 2 things, I continued. They asked me to build frameworks that didn't rely on my memory alone. And they asked legal to put protections in place so that nobody with a spreadsheet could casually pull this brick out of the wall without understanding what it was supporting. I tapped the folder. That's what this is, not a trap, a safety mechanism for all of you. Priya was scrolling now through a PDF on her screen, clearly having pulled up the full contract. Her jaw tightened. Ryan, our CEO finally said, speaking for the first time. Are you suggesting that restructuring your role increases our risk? No, I said. I'm stating that restructuring it the way Ethan just proposed automatically activates a set of obligations and rights that none of you seem to be accounting for. What obligations? Ethan demanded. Priya answered before I could. Acceleration of deferred compensation and contingent equity, she said quietly. Plus, Additional payments tied to net client outflows in the 12 months following termination, if those outflows are linked to a loss of risk leadership continuity, she swallowed. It also cross-references certain client agreements, she added, some of which have termination or withdrawal rights if Ryan's function changes without their approval. Ethan stared at her. How bad? The CEO asked. We need to model it, Priya said. But significant. I looked at Ethan. You asked why you're paying me this much, I said. You're not. The company is paying for not having to find out what happens when I'm gone without a plan. Silence. I picked up my folder. Look, I added, voice still calm. You do what you need to do, but if you decide to restructure, do it with eyes open. Don't pretend you weren't warned. I left the folder with Priya and walked out. No dramatic storming, no slam of the door. Just a quiet exit and a copy of the fine print in the middle of their cost savings party. They didn't stop the meeting. They just changed the tone. Ethan still pushed. He'd committed to the savings mentally. People like him don't back down easily. By that afternoon, I had a meeting invite on my calendar. Role realignment discussion 30 minutes. Next day, 10:00 a.m. I won't drag you through the entire conversation. You already know how those go. Words like evolving needs, strategic direction, appreciate all you've done, a printed packet with bullet points about transition support. A number on the last page presented like a gift instead of like a calculation. What he didn't expect was that I didn't argue. I won't fight you on this, I said, sliding the packet back across the table. If you've decided you don't need this role, that's your call. He looked surprised. That said, I continued, I'll expect the company to honor the agreement we signed when you decided you did need it. I'm sure legal will review everything, he said, a shade too quickly. They've already read it, I replied, twice if I had to guess. You might want to sit down with them before you finalize anything. That was on a Thursday. By Friday morning, the first tremor hit. Not to me, to them. Our largest client, an international pension fund consortium, sent a short email to our CEO, CCing legal and a generic risk mailbox. Subject: Leadership Continuity Clarification Body. We understand there may be upcoming changes to your risk leadership structure. As per Section 14.2 of our Master Services Agreement, any change in designated senior risk officer requires 90 days notice and prior written approval. Please confirm whether your current plans comply with these provisions. We reserve all rights under the agreement. Priya forwarded it to me from her personal address with a single line. They noticed. Of course they had. These were not retail investors. Their own survival depended on reading the fine print in every relationship they had. They held our risk reports in one hand and our contract in the other. If those two stopped matching, their lawyers noticed. And that consortium was not alone. By midday, 3 more of our major clients had quietly asked variations of the same question. Is Ryan staying? If not, who replaces him? And why were we not told? Someone in the executive suite realized that pushing me out over a weekend and announcing a new risk structure on Monday might not go down as smoothly as Ethan's slide deck suggested. But they'd started the process. My official last day was now a date in HR's system. Internally, the continuity clause had already triggered. Contractually, the clock had started, and the numbers they thought they were about to save had turned into numbers they couldn't control. By the following week, Finance had run the first serious model on what full enforcement of Section 8.4 would look like. The summary landed in the CEO's inbox. Immediate acceleration of my deferred comp and equity, low 8 figures. Minimum guaranteed additional payout index to client outflows, much higher. Potential redemption exposure if even a fraction of the big clients exercise termination rights, measured not in millions, in billions. Roughly $2.7 billion at full cascade. That's when the calls started. From inside, from outside, from people who understood that this wasn't about one person's salary anymore. It was about what happens when leadership treats a risk function like a cost center in a business whose entire value rests on trust. The next few weeks were a blur of quiet chaos on their side, not mine. I didn't storm social media. I didn't leak documents. I did 3 things. I answered my attorney's calls. I answered my clients' calls. I said only what was true and written. To my former employer through counsel, the message was simple. You had and still have a choice. Follow the process in the contract and manage a transition properly, or violate it and watch the clause do what it was designed to do. To clients, the message was even simpler. My status is changing. Here is what your contract says about that. You have rights. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm just not going to pretend everything's fine if it is. Clients are not stupid. They read their own agreements. They talked to each other. Within days, one big European insurer put new projects on hold pending risk leadership clarity. A U.S. public pension fund sent formal notice that they considered our undisclosed restructuring a breach of their continuity provisions. Another institution triggered an early review clause, which was a polite way of saying, "We're shopping." Every one of those actions fed back into the exposure calculations on Priya's spreadsheets. The $2.7 billion wasn't a random number. It was the combined value of contracts that could walk if they decided Northline no longer felt as safe as it used to. Ethan still tried to spin. This is overblown, he argued, according to someone who was in those meetings. Clients are sticky. They won't actually leave over one name change. He was partly right. They weren't leaving over one name. They were leaving over the message that name change sent. We think the person standing between you and regulatory disaster is optional. In the end, the board did what boards always do when faced with a choice between swallowing a painful lesson quietly or letting it explode publicly. They paid. They didn't pay because they liked me. They didn't pay because they suddenly saw the light and decided risk was noble. They paid because the alternative was hemorrhaging clients in full view of regulators and markets. They executed the clause. The full thing. My deferred comp and equity accelerated. The additional amounts indexed to outflows were crystallized at an agreed scenario level based on a blended forecast that made their auditors comfortable and Laura satisfied. They made the payments. They put out a carefully phrased internal memo about Ryan's planned transition and the company's ongoing commitment to risk excellence. They quietly reassigned Ethan. Not fired. That would invite questions. He moved into a role with no direct reports and no say over headcount. I got a wire confirmation, then another, then a final one, 8 figures in total. It sounds dramatic when you say it like that. It was math. On a Friday afternoon in a quiet office, a decades-long career in risk and regulatory architecture translated into numbers on a screen. My wife, Mia, cried when I showed her, not because she suddenly saw dollar signs. Because she finally saw proof that I hadn't been crazy all those nights I'd sat at the kitchen table with contracts spread out, red penning clauses that everyone else treated like boilerplate. It worked, she said softly. It did what it was supposed to, I replied. Here's the part that matters more than the payout. 3 months after I left, I was sitting across a table in a different building, in a different city, talking to a different leadership team. They didn't ask the question Ethan had. They didn't open with, "Why were you so expensive?" They opened with, "How did nobody else listen to you?" The firm was a global asset manager. Quiet, serious, older than any of the people in the room. Their head of risk, a woman named Ingrid, slid a printout across the table. It was a news article that had done the rounds in our niche. Vague enough to avoid naming names, clear enough that everyone in the industry understood exactly what had happened at Northline. "You designed that clause, didn't you?" She asked. "I negotiated it," I said. "My attorney drafted it, and the PE firm approved it because they were smarter 3 years ago than some of their successors turned out to be." She smiled. "We don't want you to design clauses that protect you from us," she said. "We want you to design frameworks that protect us from everyone else." That's how I knew I was in the right room this time. They weren't afraid of the fact that I'd protected myself. They were reassured by it. Because people who take their own risk seriously are the ones you trust with yours. If you've been listening to all of this thinking, that's great for you, Ryan, but I'm not in finance, I don't have billion-dollar clients, I don't have a fancy clause. Here, that's what actually translates. Leverage doesn't show up the day they decide you're too expensive. It shows up in what you wrote down years earlier when nobody was paying attention. It shows up in whose name is on the work, who owns the relationships. What the agreement says happens if you disappear. What notice is required? And what writes the other side as if that notice isn't given? Most people only look at their contract for salary, bonus, PTO, maybe vesting. They skim everything else. Then, one day, they find themselves in a glass room watching someone point at their line item and say, "Why are we paying them this much?" And they realize they have nothing on paper that understands what they actually do. If you remember nothing else from this story, remember this. If your work is critical, your value can't live only in people's memories. It has to live in the documents, in the job definition that acknowledges what happens if you're not there, in the continuity clauses that require notice before you're erased, in the agreements that define your role as more than nice to have. Because when someone like Ethan walks in with a spreadsheet and a mandate, he's not malicious. He's ignorant. He thinks he's cutting fat. He doesn't know he's slicing into an artery until the room fills with numbers nobody can stop. The company that thought I was too expensive learned that lesson in about 48 hours. They didn't just lose a person. They almost lost $2.7 billion in confidence. Confidence that had taken 14 years, countless audits, and more sleepless nights than I care to admit to build. So if your name is the quiet constant behind systems, clients, processes, or stability, do yourself a favor. The next time you have a contract in front of you, employment, consulting, whatever, don't just ask, "What's the salary?" Ask, "What happens if I'm gone?" If the answer is nothing changes, you're disposable. If the answer is we don't know, you have leverage you haven't formalized yet. And if the answer is written in a clause that someone waves off as legalese, smile. Because the day someone with a fresh MBA, a pretty slide deck, and no idea what you really do starts asking why you cost so much, you won't have to shout. You'll just have to point politely at a page they didn't bother to read. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.